Hello there, and welcome back to the Codex. Today we're going to be talking about yet another persistence build, this time on Garuda. Let's go ahead and hop into that. Starting off with the Archon shards, we're using 2 max health shards, which give 225 health each, meaning that both of these gives 450. We're using 2 casting speed shards for very spammy casting. Depending on how much you want to cast, it makes you feel a lot better. And we're using a parkour velocity shard, always a favorite. Now, it is worth noting in regards to the health shards, if you want to go even more health crazy on this frame, instead of running the Azure health shards, you could run the Topaz Archon shards for the gain 2 health per enemy killed with blast damage, maxing out at 450 health. So a single one of these shards actually gives the same amount of health as both of these shards together. So if you were to make both of these Topazes instead of Azures, for example, then instead of adding 450 health to the build, you'd be adding 900. It's just that it's conditional to you using blast damage. So if you don't mind the conditionality of this for the higher health buff, you can feel free to do that and make this build even more absurdly tanky than it already is. But as you're going to see once we get to the gameplay showcase, the build is very absurdly tanky, and you probably won't need that. So hopping into the actual build here, I will note this build is far more expensive than the builds that I usually showcase, because as you can see, I am using 3 Umbral polarities due to the 3 Umbral mods on this build. However, you can copy this build without it costing 3 Umbral polarities. For example, if I switch over to Sealed Charge here, or if you would use Power Detonation, you would, as you can see, have enough extra drain here to be able to actually drop one of these Umbral polarities. So you could fit all 3 of these with only using 2 Umbral polarities. And depending on what other mod rearrangements you want to do, like maybe you don't have all these prime mods, maybe your mods aren't maxed out, you might even be able to get it down to only 1 Umbral polarity. But I did want to showcase this build as is, even though it's very high investment, even though it's very expensive, because if you can afford this, and if you want to copy it, it is hilarious how tanky this build is. All right, let's go ahead and talk about it. The arcanes that we're using are, of course, like I mentioned, Arcane Persistence. Garuda is a fantastic frame to benefit from this, especially when you pair her with Gloom. A lot of you are probably already aware of the excellent Gloom synergy on Garuda. Gloom, per usual, gives you a slow of enemies nearby, and it also gives you lifesteal. When you pair a very rapid lifesteal effect with her third ability, Bloodletting, which gives you energy back for spending health, this causes an infinite loop of energy turning into health, which turns back into energy, so on, so on, so on, and keeps cycling. And this does mean that one of the only times that this build is vulnerable to you going down, really, is if you spam a couple casts of Bloodletting, which gets your health really low. Then you might risk enemies hitting you when you're at like 2 health, for example, which is the minimum health threshold that bloodletting can put you down to, and that's why we're using Quick Thinking. So not only is this a persistence build, but it's also a energy tanking build. Quick Thinking is a nice layer survivability because, like I said, if you do spam bloodletting too much and you get yourself down to like only a few hundred or maybe even literally 2 health left, if somebody happens to hit you at that time and you don't have Quick Thinking on, then they will kill you even though you're running persistence, because persistence doesn't make you immortal. It makes you only able to take a certain amount of damage, and this, basically shores up the only real vulnerable time that this build has, which again is when you're at really low health due to that. So it's a nice synergy there. We're also running Rolling Guard, yet another layer of defense. It's also nice for purging the stats effects off of yourself that are able to basically disable persistence, whether that be magnetic procs, which directly disable persistence, or corrosive and heat procs, which due to the armor strip can indirectly disable persistence due to lowering you below the 700 armor threshold temporarily. So it's a nice layer of defense for that. We're also running Blessing because this is, of course, synergistic with persistence. This gives us an extra 1200 max health. So even though this says we have 1486 health, the amount of health that we're actually going to have is more like 2600 once you have this fully stacked up in the mission. So lots of armor. Of course, we're activating persistence. Lots of max health, almost 3000. You would actually exceed 3000 if you were to use, like I said, the Topaz shards instead of the Azure shards. So like I said, if you want to go really crazy with the health, you can feel free to do that. And then the rest of it is just, we have Prime Flow for our energy supply. And again, this is also effectively acting as a health for the build, because with 912 energy, not only do you have basically a bottomless pit of energy to cast whatever you want, combined with her third, but you also have a very, very high secondary health pool, again, thanks to Quick Thinking. The aura is up to you. I'm using Corrosive Projection instead of Growing Power, for example, because at 276% strength, getting any more strength doesn't really do anything. Gloom caps out at 272%, for example, in terms of the 95% slow, so more strength isn't really doing anything for Gloom. Having an extra lifesteal would be completely irrelevant, because whether it's honestly like 1% of your damage or 1,000% of your damage, if you hit somebody for 1,000,000 damage with your Incarnate Furus, for example, it doesn't matter what percent of it you're stealing, it's going to be a full heal. So really the only thing that matters in regards to that is maxing out the slow, which is already done. You could argue for putting range on this build, like if you felt like you didn't need the extra defensive rolling guard, or if you want to, you know, be a bit riskier and give it a quick thinking, you could put on stretch, for example, or some kind of range mod if you want to extend the range of Gloom even further, and if you wanted the extra explosion radius for throwing out the blood ball from Dreadmere. So totally up to you. So yeah, that's the build. It's very simple. This build is basically just a absurdly tanky weapons platform, and by absurdly tanky I do mean absurdly tanky. Let's go ahead and showcase that in a survival mission. All right, so here we are on the mission. As you can see, I have Gloom active. We don't have our full health pool though, or sorry, energy pool rather, so let's go ahead and pop bloodletting. There we go, instantly hundreds of energy. Shoot a single guy back to max health. That's the beauty of Gloom and bloodletting paired together. It's an infinite synergistic loop of energy to health, back to energy, and so on. Now again, we do have to kill enough guys to drop 50 orbs to max out our Arcane Blessing to get that extra 1200 max health. So at the very beginning here, you're not going to be at your full, you know, tankiness, your full defensive value. It's going to take a few moments here. And again, thanks to Gloom, you can see enemies are moving at an absolute standstill, thanks to the fact that we do have more than 272% strength. We have immediately achieved that 95% slow, so enemies are virtually completely incapable of doing anything if they're inside of your radius there. As you saw, I got down to 2 health, and they started doing energy damage to me. That is the beauty of keeping quick thinking on this build. This is a very, very tanky build with keeping that on. This does a secondary layer of defense, essentially. And yeah, honestly, this is one of the most basic builds I've put together. There's not really a whole lot to talk about. You can be even more tanky by using your Dreadmere, because now you have a shield that blocks damage from in front of you, and you're also storing up damage, so whenever you feel like it, you can go ahead and hold down the 1 and throw that blood ball and just explode the entire room in front of you. That's one of the things I was saying. If you felt like you did want more range in this build from either like stretch or overextend or whatever, you could drop either adaptation or quick thinking. Not adaptation, rolling guard or quick thinking. We're of course not using adaptation on this build. That would not really make any sense. And yeah, this is honestly about it. I mean, it's again a very simple build. It's very tanky. After playing this build, you might find it hard to go back to other builds, because this basically feels like cheating. I mean, this is, for me at least, this is essentially on like the level of Revenant in terms of ease of survivability. It is so unfathomably hard to die. It is unbelievable. I'm actually just going to stand here for a moment. Let's see what kind of damage they can do to me. I'll let them fully get through my health and get through my... In fact, I'll even help them out. Let's cast Bloodletting here. They'll get through my health. I'll start taking energy damage. And all they have to do is shoot a single guy. And boom, you're back to full health. Again, Gloom is just disgustingly good on this build. It is gross how hard it is. But the only thing that could kill you in this build is you taking like an absurd amount of constant magnetic or corrosive or heat procs and like just forcefully having your persistence disabled. As long as persistence is active and as long as you're pressing 3 basically and shooting enemies or meleeing enemies or whatever, you cannot die. I mean, I literally am having a hard time thinking of a scenario in which this build actually dies outside of absolutely insane stats application. And don't forget, you can also use your 4th. Make enemies take extra slash procs from all your damage, as if, you know, you weren't already doing enough damage. So not only is this a super tanky build, but it is also, you know, still able to utilize her abilities to a very useful extent. Let's go ahead and blow up this room right here, for example. And they're gone. Absolutely insane, millions of damage. So yeah, there it is. I don't want to drag it on too long. That's the Garuda build. Super fun, super tanky. Might make the game boring for you because it's so good, so sorry if that's the case. And with that out of the way, hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. Hopefully it's been educational, hopefully it's been entertaining, and I will see you guys in the next one.